Meno is a sophist, and like Protagoras, there are questions about the nature of virtue that Socrates is investigating in these conversations with both Meno and Protagoras. And the main question that starts with the dialogue with Meno is, can virtue be taught? And Socrates, as is typical, claims that he doesn't know, since he doesn't know what virtue is. And of course, now Meno, who is a sophist who gets paid to lecture on things such as the nature of virtue, definitely has a response. And he says virtue is being able to manage public affairs to the benefit of his friends and to the harm of enemies. And then he goes on to say it's different for women or children or slaves because they play a different role in society. And Socrates says, okay, fine, you gave some good examples, as is typical, but the problem is this doesn't help us understand the nature of virtue. And of course, Plato, who's writing this, is after the form of virtue. And we certainly don't have that by merely presenting examples. So Meno provides a second response. And he says, to rule over people, now after some clarifications, he adds, virtue is to rule over people justly. And so that addition, which is needed, of course, brings up this second question that Socrates asks. Wait a minute, is justice virtue or a virtue? And Meno is not sure what that means, so Socrates gives the example with circularity and color and so on. So, for example, this question is circularity shape itself, or is circularity a kind of a shape? And of course, it's the latter. And so if you were asked what shape is and you answered circularity, that's not the right kind of answer. And Socrates actually provides a definition of shape, that which delineates a solid, but that's another story. Okay, so the conclusion is that, like circularity, justice is a kind of a virtue, but justice is not virtue itself. There are other virtues. And so we're after the nature of virtue, and we don't have that yet. So Meno gives a third response, and he says, virtue is to desire beautiful things and to have the power to acquire them. Now, does that sound like a good definition of virtue? Well, there are a couple problems, and Socrates helps Meno see these by asking, now, if you mean desire beautiful things, do you mean good things? Are those synonymous here? Are you identifying the beautiful with the good? And Meno says, sure, we could do that, so yes. But the problem is here, this first part, no one desires what is bad, right? So this first part of this definition, to desire beautiful things or to desire good things, well, no one desires what's bad. And here's the reasoning that Socrates provides for this. No one desires to be unhappy or miserable. Now, you may know a few people that seem to be like that, but maybe they enjoy their misery, so they actually are seeking happiness. And so no one really wants to be unhappy or miserable, but to acquire the bad would be to make one miserable. And no one desires what is bad then. So everyone desires what is good. So the first half of this definition, to desire what is good, is vacuous, right? It doesn't help us understand virtue. It's just identifying a characteristic that's common to everyone. So that's one of our problems. Everyone desires what is good. So that can't be a key component of virtue. It's not a helpful part of our definition. But there's this second part, right? That leaves the key aspect of virtue, the ability to acquire the good. That was the second half of the definition that Meno provided. So now that's the only part we have left, since we've ruled out the first part. But the problem with that is, what is good must be acquired in the right way. So if you know that somebody else keeps a bunch of cash in their glove compartment in their car, and one day you know that they didn't lock their car, so you go in and take what is good, money, a bunch of cash, well, that isn't a good thing, right? That's not virtuous to do that, to steal something. So what is good must be acquired in the right way. It has to be acquired with justice and with moderation. So the key to virtue is not the ability to acquire the good either. So this third definition of Meno fails. The first part because everybody has that feature. The second part because you have to add with justice, right? You have to add another virtue in to clarify it, but then you have a circular definition. So each of Meno's proposed definitions fail. And Meno is now confused, right? He's a sophist. He's given lectures on virtue, and yet he can't define it. And aporia sets in, or aporia, if you like. And that is a nature of confusion, of thinking you know something and then finding out that you don't. But that can be a good thing. Aporia can be a good thing because it's better than thinking you know when you do not know, right? If you think you know and you don't know, you've got a problem. You're in a position where you're not able to learn is the biggest problem. But it's also a problem because if you think you know something when you don't, you can mislead other people as well. So, since Meno is now confused, Socrates claims that this may not be a bad thing. It's better than thinking you know when you don't. So at least now you recognize that you don't know the definition of virtue. So let's compare it here with something else. And he does a little geometry with Meno's slave. So Meno has a slave that's not been educated, not been taught geometry. And Socrates starts talking to the slave. And he probably draws this in the sand, you could imagine, on the ground or something. He says, given a square that has 2-foot sides and an area of 4 square feet, right? That's what it would be if each side is 2 feet. How can you make a square with twice the area, right? So this is a problem, right? A question for the slave. And so we have the square, and let each of these 4 individual boxes within the square be a 1-foot square, right? So we have a square that is 2 feet by 2 feet with a total area of 4. So here's the first thing that the slave suggests. Well, you just add double the size, right? You double the size of the sides would be your response. But you can see if we do that, the initial square in the bottom left has 4 square feet, but that means each of these 4 squares now have 4 square feet for a total of 16 square feet, and that's what you have when you have a square with sides of 4 feet. And 16 is not double the area of 4, so that's a failure. All right, so second option. So the slave recognizes it can't be as big as he thought, so instead of doubling the size, let's just add 50% of the size. Let's just add an additional foot to each side. And this is fairly close. I mean, it's closer than the first attempt at least. But of course, if you have a square drawn like that, what you have is a square that is 3 foot by 3 foot with a total area of 9 feet. And 9 is not twice the size of 4. It's a little too big still. So now the servant who thought he could make a square twice as large as the original is confused. He's in a state of aporia, but he's better off. Now he knows that his 2 ideas are incorrect, and so he's in a position where maybe he can learn. And so here's the solution. Socrates begins to ask the slave about diagonals. He wasn't familiar with the term, but he understands the concept. And through some more discussion, Socrates gets the slave to draw this larger square, the one that 3/4 of it is white in this drawing. And since the quarter that is blue is 2 feet square total, you have 3 more of those. And so that's going to come up to 8, total of 4 sections with 2 square feet. So that'll be 8 square feet. And that is what we wanted, right? The first square had 4 square feet. We wanted a square with 8 square feet. Here it is. Now, okay, so we've done a little geometry that illustrates a couple points. One, aporia can be a good thing and help you to find the right answer. But a second aspect of that is that the idea that he taught the slave geometry by asking questions. And if virtues like that, if it's teachable at all, it must be a kind of knowledge. And virtue has to be something beneficial, but it can't be merely defined as whatever is beneficial, because some things that are beneficial, like health or strength, beauty, wealth, all of these things that are desirable can be misused, right? These can bring harm. Somebody can use their strength to overpower someone and steal something. Somebody can use their wealth to bribe someone. Somebody can use their beauty to seduce someone and get a position that they shouldn't have, they're not qualified for. So all of these things can be misused in some way. So virtue can't be merely defined as that which is beneficial. So we rule out that definition as well. And yet only those things that are directed by wisdom are truly beneficial. When you have health and it's directed by wisdom, then you're going to be in good shape. The same with beauty and wealth and other desirable things. So wisdom seems to be the underlying factor here that makes something beneficial. And so maybe virtue just is wisdom. And that's the idea that is pursued in Protagoras, the dialogue with Protagoras. But now we have this concern. If virtue is wisdom, it should be able to be taught. So Socrates now, notice we're starting this new direction here. These are not Meno's suggestions. These are Socrates' suggestions now. But then it seems like we have an answer, right? If it's able to be taught, that there must be teachers and learners. But Socrates says that this doesn't really make sense. It doesn't fit with our experience. And he identifies several men who are virtuous people, but they have children who are not virtuous. And so if they're virtuous, one of the things of being virtuous is you would want to teach your children well. And so that would be a characteristic of being virtuous. But if they have children who are not virtuous, that means they must not be able to teach their children virtue. So our experience tells us that virtue cannot be taught. So this is our conclusion. And now we're in kind of a conundrum, because if it seems to Socrates that wisdom is the key to virtue, in fact, that's what we might call a Socratic doctrine, but on the other hand, it's pretty clear from experience that virtue cannot be taught. And so we have this opposing views, right? We have this apparent contradiction. If it's wisdom, it can be taught, but it can't be taught. So Socrates, at least in this dialogue with Meno, concludes, well, here's a possibility. Here's one way to save the idea. We have reason to think that virtue can be taught, right? It's similar to helping the slave learn geometry. We can do this by the theory of recollection, which is explained in other dialogues. And we also have some reason to think that it can't be taught, and that's by experience. And what Socrates says is Okay, let's think of knowledge itself. Knowledge is not merely true belief. So suppose I need to water the garden, and it's been sunny and hot for several days and the garden needs watered, but I don't want to do it. I'm lazy, and so I just say to myself, it'll rain tomorrow. Now, I haven't checked the weather forecast. I have no idea. I have no reason to believe that it would rain tomorrow. I just say that, and then to comfort myself with my laziness, I say, yes, it's going to rain, and then I come out to believe that it's going to rain. Now, suppose the next day it rains. I had a true belief that it was going to rain, but that was not a justified belief. I had no good reasons to believe that. So it's not knowledge. I didn't know that it was going to rain, and it still makes sense to say that, right? I didn't know that it was going to rain. I believed it was going to rain. It was true that it was going to rain, but I didn't know that. There must be something else to knowledge. It has to be justified. But maybe having a true belief, well, having a true belief can be good, right? So if in that case I say, I didn't need to water it, well, it turns out I didn't need to water it. And if you really don't know the direction someplace and you just make it up, but it happens to be accurate, the person you're talking to will end up with a true belief, and that'll help them to get to where they need to go. So having a true belief can be good. And so Socrates, at the end of the dialogue here, says that maybe virtue is like a gift from the gods, right? It just comes to certain people. Maybe it's some other form of wisdom that cannot be tied down, can't be justified. And if it can't be justified, then you can't explain it, and then you can't teach it. And so that's where we conclude here. Obviously, we have a lot more to explore on the nature of virtue, and that's taken up in the book, The Protagoras.